Did you see the interview last night? Oprah returned with Meghan and Harry in what will surely go down in history as the most shocking gender reveal party of all time. At least 17 million Americans watched. Only the Super Bowl and the season premiere of The Equalizer, featuring another queen, Latifah, had more viewers this year, which is huge. If only there was a way these Oprah specials could vaccinate us, too. It would be amazing.
Stop scrolling, because what detonated on late-night television last night wasn't playful satire or harmless ribbing. It was open season, and Meghan Markle was suddenly the target of a live-fire monologue blitz that no one saw coming. One host went first, then another doubled down, then a third pushed it even further, all on air, all unscripted feeling, and all so sharp that viewers swear you could feel the temperature change through the screen. Insiders say Meghan wasn't expecting it, not like this. Not this coordinated, not this brutal. Jokes escalated into pointed critiques. Punchlines landed like accusations. And the audience reaction? Loud, uncomfortable, electric. The kind of laughter that sounds less like humor and more like permission. Within minutes, clips were ripped from broadcasts and blasted across social media, where they went viral at warp speed. Twitter lit up. Group chats exploded. And suddenly, the question wasn't why they joked. It was why now. Sources claim Meghan was left visibly shaken as the clips spread, scrambling to understand how a single night turned into a cultural pylon. Friends reportedly flooded her phone. Advisors allegedly went into emergency mode. Because this wasn't one bad joke, it was a narrative shift, happening live, in front of millions, with no chance to clap back in real time. What made it chilling was the tone. Not angry, not mean, confident, like the hosts sensed the tide had turned and decided to surf it instead of fight it. And once late-night comedy smells blood in the water, it rarely backs off. The scariest part? Insiders whisper this wasn't spontaneous, it felt greenlit. And if that's true, last night wasn't the peak. It was the warning shot. The moment the first punchline landed, something in the room shifted, and it wasn't subtle. The audience laughed, then hesitated, then laughed harder, as if they could feel they were crossing into territory that late-night television usually circles but rarely storms. And at the center of it all was Meghan Markle, a name that has been joked about before, but never quite like this. Not with this tone, not with this confidence, not with this sense that the gloves were officially off. It didn't start nuclear. That's what made it dangerous. The opening joke sounded almost routine, a setup about celebrity branding, public reinvention, and media fatigue. Polite laughter, familiar territory, but then the host leaned in. The smile tightened. The cadence slowed, and suddenly the jokes weren't floating anymore, they were aimed. The audience felt it. You could hear the shift in the room, that half-second pause where people register that something sharper is coming, and then the eruption when it lands anyway. Insiders say this is the moment Meghan's camp started panicking, because jokes only work when they feel safe, and these didn't. These jokes felt like commentary, like verdicts disguised as humor. The host moved from playful teasing to pointed observations about public narratives, perceived contradictions, and telling your story so many times the audience starts finishing the sentences for you. The laughter grew louder, not because it was funnier, but because it felt permission-granting. Then came the second wave, another show, another host, same night, different network, different style, same target. That's when alarms allegedly went off behind the scenes, because one host can be brushed off as coincidence. Two starts to look like a trend, and the second monologue didn't soften the tone, it escalated it. The jokes hit harder, faster, stacked back-to-back with barely a breath in between. No names dropped at first, just obvious references. Certain duchesses, endless victim arcs, branding trauma like a subscription service. The crowd roared. Clips were already being clipped before the segment ended. Twitter users timestamped punchlines in real time. Group chats filled with "Did you hear that?" And they really said it. And then, as if scripted by chaos itself, a third late-night moment followed, shorter but deadlier. A single joke, one line, no build-up. Just a clean shot that landed and moved on, leaving the audience stunned and laughing at the same time. According to sources close to Meghan, that's when the shaking started, not physical collapse, but emotional whiplash. Phones lighting up. Advisors scrambling to assess damage. Not because the jokes were untrue, but because they were resonating. That's the nightmare scenario for any public figure, when satire aligns too closely with what the audience already suspects. What made the situation even more unsettling was the lack of pushback in the room. No awkward silence, no groans, no sense the host had crossed a line. The laughter came easy, too easy. And once late-night audiences laugh without hesitation, it signals something bigger than a single joke. It signals cultural exhaustion. Fans immediately split into camps. Defenders accused the hosts of misogyny, cruelty, and opportunism. Critics said comedy was finally catching up to public sentiment. Neutral observers noticed something more chilling. This didn't feel like a hit job. It felt like late-night comedy, reading the room and deciding it was safe to say the quiet part out loud. Insiders claim Meghan's team quickly realized this wasn't a moment that could be spun away with a statement. There was no factual error to correct, no misquote to clarify. Comedy doesn't operate on corrections, it operates on vibes, and the vibe had turned hard. What the hosts were tapping into wasn't scandal, it was fatigue. Fatigue with narratives, fatigue with framing, fatigue with being told how to feel. Old interviews resurfaced instantly, not to defend her, to contextualize the jokes. Clips where Meghan spoke about reclaiming her voice were replayed alongside punchlines about never letting the microphone rest. Quotes about boundaries were paired with jokes about constant media engagement. The contrast wasn't created by the hosts, it already existed. They just spotlighted it. According to people in the industry, what made this night different from past criticism was the lack of caution. Late-night hosts usually hedge. They soften, they couch jokes in self-awareness. None of that happened here. The delivery was calm, confident, almost relieved, as if someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been stuffy for years. And once that window opens, the air rushes out fast. By the time the final clip went viral, the story had already escaped control. It wasn't about whether the jokes were fair. It was about why they landed so cleanly, why the laughter sounded unanimous, why no one rushed to defend in real time, and why multiple hosts on multiple platforms felt comfortable going there on the same night. That coincidence alone set off alarm bells. Because in Hollywood, trends don't emerge by accident. They emerge when people sense safety, when they believe the audience is ready, the risk is low, and the payoff is high. And if that's true, then last night wasn't a random pylon. It was a signal that the narrative around Meghan Markle may have crossed a threshold from protected to punchline to something far harder to reverse. And if that shift holds, the fallout won't come from jokes alone. It will come from what those jokes give others permission to say next. The aftermath didn't explode, it spread. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. By the next morning, the late-night jokes weren't just clips anymore. They were conversation starters, debate fuel, and something far more dangerous to public figures than scandal, consensus. The tone across timelines wasn't outrage. It wasn't even shock. It was recognition. And recognition is the point where panic quietly sets in. Industry insiders say this is when the real damage began. Not during the broadcasts, but after, when executives, agents, producers, and brand partners started watching the clips in private. Without laugh tracks, without studio energy. Just the jokes, clean and direct, hitting exactly where they were meant to, and the uncomfortable realization crept in. These weren't edgy risks. They were safe bets. That's the nightmare scenario in Hollywood. When ridicule becomes safe. What unsettled people wasn't that the jokes were harsh. It was that they were predictable. Multiple hosts, different networks, same framing. The same critiques, the same angles, the same tiredness in the delivery, like everyone had been holding their tongue and suddenly agreed it was okay to stop. One executive reportedly said, "It feels like the dam broke." And once a dam breaks, you don't control where the water goes. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team allegedly shifted from reaction to triage. This wasn't a situation where you clap back or release a statement. You can't correct comedy. You can't litigate laughter. The only thing you can do is assess how far the perception has drifted and whether it can still be pulled back. According to sources, that assessment didn't go well. The internet had already done what it does best, connect dots. Users stitched the jokes together with past interviews, docuseries moments, podcast clips, speeches, and headlines stretching back years. Not to fact-check, but to validate the feeling the jokes tapped into. And once people feel validated, they stop questioning. Comment sections filled with the same refrain, "This is what people have been saying privately." That sentence alone is devastating to any carefully managed image. Because it means the jokes didn't create a new opinion, they surfaced an existing one. And when late-night hosts echo what audiences already think, they aren't shaping opinion. They're confirming it. Defenders pushed back hard. They pointed out misogyny, double standards, and the cruelty of mocking a woman who's been open about trauma. And those arguments weren't wrong. but they struggled to gain traction against something far more slippery: overexposure fatigue. The criticism wasn't that Meghan spoke up, it was that people felt they'd heard the same framing too many times. Fair or not, repetition breeds impatience, and impatience breeds punchlines. Media analysts noted another chilling detail: none of the hosts walked anything back. No next night clarifications. No just jokes, folks hedging, no softening. That silence suggested confidence that the audience was with them and would stay with them. In late-night comedy, that's the green light everyone waits for. Meanwhile, brand chatter reportedly shifted tone, not cancellations. Not exits, pauses, meetings postponed, conversations reframed, people asking, "Let's see how this plays out." In Hollywood, "let's see" is code for uncertainty, and uncertainty freezes momentum faster than controversy ever could. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like doors quietly not opening. Online, the discourse hardened. What started as debate turned into labeling. Words like overplayed, calculated, and predictable appeared more often than insults. And those words are dangerous because they're about taste, not morality. You can recover from being hated. Recovering from being seen as boring, repetitive, or out of touch is far harder. Creators piled in, not to attack directly, but to analyze. Long videos dissecting why the jokes landed, why the timing felt right, why late-night comedy, usually cautious around certain figures, suddenly felt bold. And the consensus among analysts was brutal: the cultural shield was gone. For years, criticism of Meghan carried risk. Hosts hedged. Writers softened. Networks hesitated. Now, that hesitation was gone. And when risk disappears, volume follows. People say more because they believe the consequences are minimal. That belief alone changes everything. Insiders claim Meghan was deeply unsettled by that realization. Not by the jokes themselves, but by what they represented: a shift in permission. When comedians feel safe, it means audiences feel aligned. And once that alignment forms, reversing it requires more than messaging. It requires absence, recalibration, and time. Lots of time. The most unsettling part? The jokes didn't rely on new information. No scandals, no leaks. No revelations, just framing. And framing, once it sticks, becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. Future projects, statements, appearances, all filtered through the same late-night punchlines. By the end of the second day, the conversation wasn't, "Did they go too far?" It was, "Why did this feel inevitable?" And inevitability is the enemy of reinvention. Because reinvention depends on surprise, and nothing about this felt surprising anymore. Insiders say the panic wasn't about reputation alone, it was about trajectory. Once a public figure becomes a reliable punchline, they stop being aspirational and start being illustrative. Used to make points, used to signal fatigue, used to connect with audiences who feel talked at instead of talked with. And late-night hosts don't take that leap unless they're sure. As the dust from the monologues settled, one thing became clear: this wasn't a spike that would fade by the next news cycle. It was a reclassification. From protected figure to fair game, from delicate subject to open commentary. And those shifts, once they happen, are almost impossible to reverse, because comedy doesn't just reflect culture. It declares where culture thinks it's safe to stand. And right now, culture just took a step away. By the time the third phase set in, the story stopped moving like a scandal and started behaving like a reset. Not loud, not chaotic. Just a slow, unmistakable recalibration of how power, sympathy, and relevance were being assigned. The jokes had already landed. The audience had already laughed. The industry had already taken notes. What followed wasn't outrage, it was acceptance, and acceptance is far more dangerous than criticism. For Meghan Markle, this was the point where the damage no longer depended on what anyone said next. The narrative had detached from her responses entirely. Defenders could argue intent. Critics could argue fatigue. But the conversation had shifted into something harder to fight: tone memory. How people felt watching those monologues. How easily the jokes slid into place. How little resistance there was in the room. Industry insiders describe this phase as the afterimage moment, when the punchlines keep echoing even after the clips stop circulating. When writers, producers, and decision-makers subconsciously factor in how an audience might react before they attach a name to a project. Not out of malice, out of instinct, because nothing scares gatekeepers more than becoming the next punchline themselves. That's when the panic reportedly turned inward. Not frantic calls, not angry demands, strategic silence. A sudden narrowing of public-facing moves. Fewer statements, fewer appearances, No attempts to counter the jokes directly, because responding would only reinforce the frame that had already been set. Comedy doesn't lose power when you argue with it, it gains it. What unsettled Meghan's circle most, according to sources, wasn't hostility. It was indifference. The absence of outrage from people who once rushed to defend. The lack of op-eds scolding comedians. The quiet from allies who might previously have signaled support. Not because they'd turned against her, but because they sensed the moment wasn't defensible in the same way anymore. This is where the late-night shift revealed its real impact. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about permission. Permission for others to disengage without feeling guilty. Permission to stop framing criticism as taboo. Permission to move on emotionally without announcing it. And once that permission spreads, it doesn't get rescinded. Analysts noted something else equally chilling. The jokes didn't age out after 24 hours. They stayed relevant. Not because people kept sharing them, but because they fit too neatly into existing conversations. They didn't feel like a reaction to a news cycle. They felt like a summary. And summaries are hard to shake. In the days that followed, the cultural temperature cooled, but not in her favor. Fewer heated debates. Fewer defenders jumping into comment sections. More people simply shrugging and scrolling past. And in celebrity culture, apathy is more damaging than backlash. Backlash still means people care. Apathy means they've decided they already understand the story. Behind closed doors, insiders say the focus shifted to long-term recalibration. Not image repair, image subtraction. Pulling back instead of pushing forward. Letting time do the work that messaging can't. Because once a figure becomes shorthand for a certain kind of fatigue, the only way to reset is to stop supplying material that reinforces it. The irony is that nothing new was revealed. No scandal, no exposure, no lie caught on tape. The nuclear moment wasn't about facts, it was about framing finally catching up to sentiment. And sentiment doesn't respond to rebuttals. It responds to absence. Late-night comedy has always played this role quietly. It doesn't create villains out of nowhere. It senses when an audience is ready to stop protecting someone, when empathy has thinned, when repetition has dulled impact. And then it steps in, not as an aggressor, but as a translator. That's why this moment feels irreversible. Not because Meghan can't recover. Public figures recover all the time. But because recovery now requires a different strategy than before. Less explanation, less visibility, less insistence on being understood, more space, more patience, more willingness to let the narrative loosen its grip naturally. The danger is that trying to reclaim control too quickly would only confirm the joke's premise, that the story is being managed, that the framing matters more than the substance. And once that suspicion takes hold, even sincerity gets filtered as performance. What's left now is a waiting game, waiting to see whether absence cools fatigue or deepens it, waiting to see whether future appearances feel refreshed or redundant, waiting to see whether the late-night moment becomes a footnote or a turning point people reference years from now as when it changed. Because that's what late-night comedy does at its most powerful. It doesn't destroy careers, it reclassifies them, from aspirational to observational, from untouchable to discussable, from protected to fair game. And once that reclassification happens, the burden shifts entirely to the subject. Not to defend themselves, but to evolve in a way that feels organic enough to make the jokes obsolete. That's the real aftermath of going nuclear on live television. Not the laughter, but the silence that follows when everyone quietly agrees they've heard enough and waits to see whether anything truly new will ever be said again. If you're still here right now, understand this. You didn't just watch a late-night roast, you watched a cultural line get crossed. Moments like this don't announce their importance when they happen. They reveal it later, when you realize the tone has changed, the protection is gone, and the conversation no longer sounds the same. That's why clicking away now is the worst move you could make. Because this is how narratives truly shift, not with scandals, but with permission. Permission for jokes to land. Permission for silence to spread. Permission for people to stop defending and start disengaging. And once that permission is out in the open, it doesn't get walked back. It multiplies quietly while everyone pretends nothing happened. So if you felt that chill when the laughter sounded a little too comfortable, hit like right now. That tells the algorithm, and everyone watching, that you caught the moment most people will only understand in hindsight. Drop a comment because the comment section is where the real analysis lives, where people compare patterns, notice timing, and call out shifts before headlines catch up. And subscribe immediately, not later. Later is when narratives are already rewritten, when clips are gone, and when everyone suddenly says, "Oh yeah, that was the turning point." Being subscribed means you catch the pivot as it happens, not after it's been normalized. This isn't about picking sides, it's about paying attention. Stories like this don't explode twice, they settle in, and the ones who stay locked in are always the first to recognize when a single night quietly changes everything. Stay here, stay alert, because once culture moves on, it never sends a warning.